The CEO of my wife's company was down on one knee, holding open a diamond ring box, and my wife, the woman I had loved for 11 years, did not say no. For a few seconds, I forgot how to breathe. My hand was still on the conference room door. The flowers I had bought for Linda were tucked under my arm, wrapped in brown paper, the way she liked. Inside my coat pocket were 2 tickets to Paris, folded neatly in an envelope. I had planned the whole thing for Valentine's Day. I was going to surprise her, take her to dinner, and tell her we needed to remember who we were before work bills and quiet dinners had started turning us into strangers. Instead, I stood there watching Charles Whitmore, the polished 52-year-old CEO of Whitmore Technologies, kneel in front of my wife like a man in a movie. Linda stood across from him, pale and still. She did not smile, but she did not pull away either. That was what broke me. Not the ring, not the flowers on the table, not even the way Charles looked at her like he owned the moment. It was the silence. I felt heat crawl up my neck. My first instinct was to throw the door open, step inside, and ask my wife what kind of fool she thought I was. I could already hear my own voice rising. I could already imagine the scene, the CEO scrambling to his feet, Linda crying, office workers turning their heads, everybody watching my marriage fall apart behind glass walls. Then a hand closed around my arm. Firm, calm, not frightened. I turned sharply. A woman stood beside me in the hallway, elegant, about late 40s, with silver blonde hair pulled back and eyes that looked like they had not slept in days. She leaned close and whispered, "Stay calm. The show has only just begun." I stared at her, too stunned to speak. She glanced toward the conference room, then back at me. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said quietly. "Charles is my husband." That sentence hit me almost as hard as the ring. Before I could ask anything, she shook her head. "Not here, not now. If you walk into that room, you'll give him exactly what he wants." I looked back through the narrow opening. Linda's hands were trembling. And for the first time, I wondered if I was witnessing betrayal. Or something much worse. I wanted to pull away from Margaret and march straight into that conference room. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to demand an explanation. Instead, I followed a stranger. She led me through a side hallway, past a row of empty offices, and into a small employee cafe that had nearly emptied out for lunch. She chose a table in the far corner where no one could overhear us. Neither of us spoke until she was certain we were alone. Finally, she looked directly at me. "I'm sorry you had to see that." I laughed bitterly. "Sorry your husband is proposing to my wife." She didn't flinch. "No," she said quietly. "He's trapping her." I folded my arms. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to listen." There was something about the way she said it, not defensive, not dramatic, that made me stay in my seat. Margaret reached into her leather briefcase and placed a thick envelope on the table. Inside were photocopies of emails, accounting reports, and handwritten notes. None of it meant much to me. She pointed to several highlighted pages. Linda found irregularities in Whitmore Technologies' financial records about 6 months ago. Millions of dollars were being moved through shell vendors that didn't actually provide services. I frowned. Linda never told me any of this. "I know." "Why not?" Margaret sighed. "Because Charles made sure she was too frightened to tell anyone." She explained that Charles had spent years building a spotless public reputation. He donated to charities, spoke at business conferences, and was regularly featured in local business magazines. Behind closed doors, he was different. Employees who questioned him suddenly found themselves demoted. Others quietly resigned. A few signed confidentiality agreements and disappeared without another word. Then Linda discovered numbers that didn't add up. "She wasn't looking for fraud," Margaret said. "She was simply doing her job." I stared at the papers. "If that's true, why the ring?" Margaret looked toward the window before answering. "Because Charles knows investigators are getting close." She lowered her voice. "If he convinces everyone your wife is having an affair with him, then when the fraud becomes public, she'll look like a willing accomplice instead of the employee who uncovered it." The idea sounded almost unbelievable. "So today's proposal was never about love," Margaret finished. "It was about control." I rubbed my forehead. Nothing made sense anymore. Linda had looked terrified. Not guilty, terrified. Margaret slid one final photograph across the table. It showed Charles standing outside a courthouse with 2 attorneys. "This was taken 3 days ago," she said. "He's preparing for something." I looked up. "What do you want from me?" She met my eyes without hesitation. "I need your help." I hesitated for several long seconds. Every part of me still wanted to believe my wife had simply made a terrible mistake. But another part, the part that knew Linda better than anyone, kept replaying the look on her face in that conference room. It wasn't the face of a woman in love. It was the face of someone who felt cornered. I drove home with the flowers still sitting on the passenger seat. By the time I pulled into the driveway, they had already begun to wilt. I almost threw them into the trash. Instead, I carried them inside and placed them in a vase on the kitchen counter. Old habits are hard to break. For 11 years, Linda and I had built a quiet life together. We weren't flashy people. We paid our bills on time, took weekend trips whenever we could, and argued about ordinary things, whose turn it was to grocery shop, what color to paint the guest room, whether we really needed to replace the old refrigerator. Nothing about our marriage had ever prepared me for what I'd seen that afternoon. Around 7 o'clock, I heard Linda's car pull into the driveway. I took a slow breath. Whatever happened next would matter. She walked through the front door carrying her laptop bag. The first thing she noticed was the flowers. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "I bought them for you." A faint smile appeared, then disappeared almost instantly. "I'm sorry I'm late." "I know." She looked as though she wanted to say something else. She didn't. Dinner was unusually quiet. Normally, Linda filled the silence with stories about work or funny conversations she'd overheard in the office. That night, she barely touched her food. Twice her phone vibrated. Twice she looked at the screen. Twice she declined the call without saying a word. I recognized the company number. Neither of us mentioned it. Later that evening, while she was upstairs taking a shower, I walked into our home office looking for a notepad. That's when I noticed something unusual. One of the desk drawers was locked. Linda had never locked that drawer before. For a brief moment, I considered forcing it open. Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. "If you confront them now, you'll give him exactly what he wants." I stepped away. A few minutes later, Linda came downstairs wearing an old gray sweatshirt I had given her years earlier. She looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. She sat beside me on the couch without saying a word. After a long silence, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder. It was such a familiar gesture that my heart nearly broke. "Long day?" I asked. "The longest," she whispered. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to ask about Charles, the ring, the proposal. Instead, I simply nodded. "I'm here if you need me." For a second, I thought she was going to tell me the truth. Her eyes filled with tears. She reached for my hand. Then her phone rang again. She looked at the screen. The color drained from her face. Without answering, she stood up and walked into the bedroom, quietly closing the door behind her. I remained on the couch, listening to the muffled sound of her voice through the wall. I couldn't make out the words. Only the fear. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time since we'd been married, I realized something terrible. The biggest threat to our marriage wasn't another man. It was the secret that had come home with my wife. Part 4. The trap was never about love. The next morning, Linda left for work before sunrise. She kissed my cheek, whispered, "I'll see you tonight," and walked out the door with the same tired smile she'd worn for weeks. I waited until I heard her car disappear down the street. Then I called Margaret. She answered on the first ring. "Meet me where we were yesterday," she said. An hour later, we sat across from each other in the same quiet corner of the employee cafe. This time, she brought a laptop. Without saying a word, she turned the screen toward me. It showed security footage from the executive conference room. The recording had no audio, but I immediately recognized the moment I'd witnessed. Charles stepping forward. Charles lowering himself onto one knee. Charles opening the ring box. Then Margaret paused the video. "Watch Linda." I leaned closer. The expression on Linda's face was completely different from what I had remembered in my shock. She wasn't looking at the ring. She wasn't looking at Charles. She was staring toward the closed conference room door, toward the exit, like someone calculating how to escape. Margaret pressed play again. Charles said something. Linda's shoulders stiffened. She slowly lowered her eyes. She never reached for the ring. She never smiled. She simply stood there. "I've watched this recording at least 20 times, Margaret said quietly. "This isn't the face of a woman being proposed to." "It isn't," I admitted. "It's the face of someone being threatened." Margaret closed the laptop. Then she told me everything. 6 months earlier, Linda had uncovered accounting entries that didn't match vendor payments. At first, she assumed they were simple bookkeeping errors. They weren't. The company had been paying millions of dollars to shell corporations that existed only on paper. When Linda began asking questions, Charles invited her into his office. He praised her intelligence, offered her a promotion. Then, little by little, the conversations changed. He reminded her that he personally approved executive careers. That one negative performance review could end years of hard work. When that didn't silence her, the threats became personal. Charles had quietly investigated our family. He knew where I worked. He knew the mortgage balance on our house. He even knew the college savings account we'd started for our 10-year-old daughter, Emma. If your wife keeps digging, he had told Linda, accidents happen to good people. I felt sick. He threatened us. Margaret nodded. But he needed something else. What a reason for no one to believe her. She explained Charles's final plan. The proposal wasn't meant to end in marriage. It was meant to become office gossip. Photos, rumors, whispers. If federal investigators questioned Linda later, Charles would simply paint her as a jealous employee who had become emotionally involved with him. A woman trying to save herself. A woman no one should trust. Suddenly every piece fit together. The silence. The fear. The ring. Linda hadn't refused. Not because she wanted Charles. Because she believed refusing him in that room would put our family directly in his crosshairs. I lowered my head into my hands. For 24 hours, I believed my wife had betrayed me. The truth was even harder to accept. She'd been carrying this nightmare alone. I didn't tell Linda that I knew. Looking back, that may have been the hardest decision I made in my entire life. Every evening she came home looking a little more exhausted, and every evening I wanted to tell her she didn't have to carry the burden alone. But Margaret was convinced Charles was watching her. He monitors company emails, office cameras, and even employees' parking records, she told me. If he suspects Linda has told anyone, he'll change everything before investigators can move. So I waited, and I watched. For the first time in our marriage, silence became an act of protection instead of distance. A few days later, Linda left for work before I did. As I poured my coffee, I noticed a folded grocery receipt beside the sugar bowl. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention were the numbers written on the back. April 18th, 2022. Vendor 731. Storage C. No explanation. Just 3 short lines. I stared at them for a long moment. Linda had always known I noticed details. It was one of the reasons she joked that I could never lose a game of Clue. I slipped the receipt into my wallet. That afternoon, I showed it to Margaret. She smiled for the first time since we'd met. She's talking to you. I don't understand. She can't risk saying anything out loud. Charles has probably warned her not to, but she's giving us breadcrumbs. Over the next 2 weeks, more breadcrumbs appeared. A shipping invoice left open on the kitchen counter. A highlighted newspaper article about abandoned warehouse leases. A sticky note with nothing but a license plate number. None of it looked important by itself. Together it formed a map. Using my background in logistics, I traced the warehouse listed as Storage C. According to public records, it belonged to a vendor that supposedly handled computer equipment for Whitmore Technologies. Except, the building had been vacant for nearly 3 years. No trucks, no employees, no deliveries. Just an empty warehouse receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. Federal investigators confirmed the same thing. Charles had been paying fake companies for work that never existed. And every payment eventually disappeared into accounts he secretly controlled. For the first time since Valentine's Day, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. Not because we had won. Because Linda hadn't given up. Every clue she left behind told me the same thing without speaking a single word. I trust you. One evening she came home unusually quiet. As we cleaned up after dinner, our hands reached for the same coffee mug. She looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she squeezed my hand ever so slightly before letting go. It lasted less than 2 seconds. But it said more than any conversation could have. She knew I was standing beside her. She just didn't know. I already understood why. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore walked into work every morning believing he still controlled every piece on the board. He had no idea the game had already begun to turn against him. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 o'clock. Margaret called me the night before. "Tomorrow is the day," she said. "Are they ready? The FBI has enough to execute a search warrant. They just need Charles to authorize one last transaction. Once he signs it, there's no arguing it was someone else's decision." I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of what would happen to Charles. I was afraid of what Linda would have to endure before it was over. The next morning, I parked across the street from Whitmore Technologies. I wasn't supposed to be there. Neither was Margaret. We watched employees stream into the building carrying coffee cups and laptops, completely unaware that the company's world was about to change. At 10:17, Margaret's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It's happening. Inside the executive boardroom, Charles began presenting what he called a routine financial restructuring. Several board members nodded without asking many questions. Linda sat halfway down the table, a thick folder in front of her. Charles smiled. As our senior financial analyst, he said, "Linda has reviewed every document. I just need her signature before we move forward." He slid the folder toward her. Linda looked down but didn't pick up the pen. The room grew quiet. Charles smiled again, though this time it looked forced. Everything all right, Linda. Before she could answer, the conference room doors opened. Two FBI agents walked in, followed by investigators from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Every conversation stopped. One of the agents held up a warrant. Charles Whitmore. Charles slowly stood. I'm Charles Whitmore. We have a federal search warrant for your office and all financial records related to Whitmore Technologies. The color drained from his face. This is ridiculous. It'll all be explained. Charles immediately pointed across the table. You should be talking to her. Every head turned toward Linda. She's the one who handled these accounts, Charles said. If anyone manipulated the books, it was my finance department. For one terrifying moment, I thought his plan might actually work. Then another agent placed several binders on the conference table. We've already reviewed months of emails, bank records, and shell company filings. He opened the first binder. Every fraudulent transfer required your personal authorization. A second binder contained surveillance logs. A third included recorded phone calls. Charles's confidence began to disappear. He looked toward Linda. She finally met his eyes. For the first time since Valentine's Day, she wasn't afraid. Then she calmly stood up. I've spent 6 months waiting for this day, she said. And I have one more thing to add. The room became so quiet that no one moved. Not even Charles. Everyone waited for Linda to speak. Linda took a slow breath before speaking. I discovered irregular payments during our third quarter audit. She said, her voice steady, despite everything she'd been through. When I reported the discrepancies to Mr. Whitmore, he told me they were confidential executive transactions. She paused. When I refused to approve them without documentation, he threatened my family. No one interrupted her. She described the late-night phone calls, the unexpected meetings, the pressure to sign documents she knew were wrong. Then she looked directly at the federal agents. I never signed a single fraudulent payment. Charles laughed, a desperate, nervous laugh. She's lying. Linda calmly opened the folder she'd carried into the meeting. Inside were copies of every document Charles had asked her to approve. Each one contained handwritten notes in the margins. Dates, times, names, every conversation she'd secretly documented over the past 6 months. I wrote everything down, she said. I knew that one day I'd have to prove I wasn't imagining any of it. The lead agent nodded. We've already verified much of this. Charles's shoulders sagged. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked like an ordinary man instead of the confident executive everyone admired. Within minutes, the agents escorted him out of the boardroom. He glanced back once, not at Margaret, not at the board members, at Linda. She didn't look away. She simply watched him leave. Later that afternoon, Linda walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box with a few personal belongings. I was waiting near the parking lot. When she saw me, she stopped. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. You know, she whispered. I know. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then she slowly walked toward me. I'm so sorry, Robert. You should have told me. I wanted to. Her voice cracked. I almost did 100 times. Then why didn't you? She wiped her eyes. Because every time I tried, I heard his voice reminding me that he knew where you worked, where Emma went to school. How easy it would be to ruin everything we'd built. She lowered her head. I thought if I carried it alone, you'd be safe. I reached for her hands. They were never yours to carry alone. She began crying, not the quiet tears she'd hidden for months, but the kind that come when someone finally feels safe enough to stop pretending. I pulled her into my arms. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We simply stood there in the parking lot holding onto each other while the world around us kept moving. A few minutes later, Margaret walked out of the building. She smiled gently. They'll be filing for divorce this afternoon, she said. I nodded. I'm sorry. She shook her head. No. For the first time, her smile reached her eyes. I'm finally free. As she walked toward her car, I realized something. Justice doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes, it looks like people quietly getting their lives back. The 2 tickets to Paris stayed in my desk drawer for almost 4 months. Every time I opened it to pay a bill or look for a pen, I'd see the envelope tucked beneath a stack of old papers. For a while, I couldn't even bring myself to touch it. Those tickets reminded me of the worst afternoon of my life. Then one Saturday morning, Linda quietly placed a cup of coffee beside me. I've been thinking, she said. So have I. She smiled. What if we stopped remembering what almost happened and started remembering why we wanted to go in the first place? I looked at the envelope. For the first time, I didn't see betrayal. I saw a second chance. A month later, we were walking hand in hand along the Seine River, just as I'd imagined on Valentine's Day. Only this time there were no surprises, no secrets, and no fears hiding between us. Paris wasn't magical because of the city. It was magical because we had finally learned how to tell each other the truth. One evening, we found a small cafe tucked away on a quiet side street. As the sun settled behind the old buildings, Linda reached across the table and took my hand. "I've replayed that day in the conference room 1,000 times," she said softly. "So have I. If I could change one thing, you would have told me." She nodded. "And if I could change one thing," I replied, "I would have trusted the woman I married before trusting what my eyes thought they saw." Neither of us had been perfect. She made the mistake of carrying fear alone. I made the mistake of believing silence always meant betrayal. Marriage isn't tested when life is easy. It's tested when fear convinces two people to stop talking. Charles Whitmore eventually pleaded guilty to multiple federal fraud charges. Several executives who had helped him accepted plea agreements. Whitmore Technologies survived under new leadership, and Linda was invited to stay with the company. She declined. Peace was worth more than another promotion. Today, Linda works for a smaller firm where integrity matters more than titles. Emma still laughs at my terrible jokes, and every Valentine's Day we buy fresh flowers, not because we need to erase the past, but because we survived it together. If this story reminded you that trust should always be stronger than fear, I hope you'll share it with someone you love. And if you enjoy stories about family forgiveness and quiet justice, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me again for the next one. Thank you for spending your time with me.